Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin, our tour through my Penguin Classic wall. We are currently waddling around in the broad Renaissance period, at the bottom of the first bookcase, and that even remote sense of order is probably going to get blown out of the water. Probably starting sometime next week when we leave that bookcase and leave the area that I even lightly organized. And the rest of the penguins tend not to be organized, so who knows what we will lose the steady progression of a classroom-like syllabus, and we will move into the wilds of just not knowing what you're going to get every day. I'm okay with that. I'm hoping that the rest of you are, because I really don't think I'm going to summon the will between now and then to organize the rest of my Penguin Classics. Bad enough that I have to organize that first section, and I do. Because we've been going through this, and as we've been going through it, I've been pulling out doubles. I've been pulling out books that I don't want, older editions, translations that I don't want. I've been pulling out stuff like that and rearranging stuff, what one of you called book Tetris, that never ends. For me, especially in this little book room, it never ends. Book Tetris never ends. You are always pulling things out and moving them around and making decisions of, do I have the space for this? And that's part of why I want to do this Penguin Classic Daily Penguin thing, is to make sense of this collection so that I know exactly what I have and I want exactly what I have. But today we are in the Italian Renaissance. We are dealing with a work that, like a couple of other things that we have seen, is viewed as a signature text of the Italian Renaissance, and it raises a question that will probably beset most of our future penguins. We've had two of those questions so far in this year-long waddle through my penguins. First was the pitiless ratio of the survival of a text. That's going to become less important as we move further on in time, and especially once we get into the era of movable type. Once we get into the era of the printing press, that becomes much less of an issue, most cases. And when it is an issue, it's suddenly a talking point. Whereas with a lot of literature in the ancient world, all you have to do is cite what the ratio is. It's not a talking point that it exists. It's understood that ancient sources, that ancient texts, will be getting to us by a large combination of industry and happenstance. Whereas in the modern era, the long modern era, if a book gets to us by one manuscript only, that will be a remarkable thing. It'll be worth commenting on. So that's going to become less of an issue. Another thing that an issue that we've been dealing with all along is the vagaries of translation. That will stay with us, and we'll always have something interesting to talk about there. Although even that lessens just a little when we're talking about the Romance languages, where every translator now will have not only fairly compatible language translation, nothing like ancient Greek, but also many previous English translations to consult. That smooths the process. We'll see lots of exceptions to that, but that smooths the process. But there's another question that has come up, and it's come up already. I just haven't stressed it until now, and that is abridgment. A question that plagues classic reprint houses of any kind. What do you do with abridgments? An abridged version of War and Peace, an abridged version of the Parallel Lives, an abridged version even of something comparatively short like Thucydides, will have natural appeal to the school book market. If you are a Penguin editor, an editorial group, and you're aiming towards such a market, maybe a high school, well, a high school teacher is going to have an easier time foisting an abridged classic on his students than he is an unabridged one, if the unabridged one is very long. That was also true about the book buying public, just in general, in the 20th century. Once the paperback revolution took off, all sorts of publishers experimented with abridged classics because they didn't want shell shock, and also it's much more difficult to print a big mass market paperback than it is a smaller one. It kind of defeats the purpose. At the time, most places that sold mass market paperbacks had preset, measured places where they could go. Slots, racks, and if you have a mass market paperback that's that thick, it can't go anywhere. It can't fit in one of those racks, and even if it can, it's only one book for that spot instead of two. All sorts of stuff like that have been detailed in many books about the book trade in the 20th century, and it's been a great pleasure of mine to watch as that fad has disappeared, as it's fallen into disrepute. I want it to fall into disrepute. I don't want it to be acceptable to print abridged classics, to print abridged canonical works, to print abridged anything. I don't want that to be acceptable. The only case in which I would agree to that is for the author of a multi-volume work of nonfiction to themselves write a one-volume condensation of that multi-volume work. I've read quite a few of those. There's an art involved in writing that kind of a one-volume book. I've read quite a few of them, and I like them quite a bit. So I don't include those. But for canonical works, it should not happen anymore. There should not be an abridgment anymore. Just like we shouldn't take a canonical work like the Parallel Lives of Plutarch and chop it up for the interesting lives and the non-interesting lives, the parts we like and the parts we don't, the parts that have been played by Laurence Olivier and the parts that haven't. No. Don't let. I very much like the fact that nowadays the idea of approaching canonical classics is not to do that. Present them as they are. Don't abridge them. Don't chop them up. That sort of thing, with the exception of Plutarch. But aside from him, I very much like that that's the fact. But nevertheless, having taught a lot of these works myself, I do acknowledge the value of an abridged version. Even if it pains me. An abridged version of the Canterbury Tales pains me. But objectively speaking, quite a few of the Canterbury Tales are less well formed than quite a bit of others. If you read the Canterbury Tales from start to finish, no matter which ones you end up liking, you will invariably notice that some of them are more finished than others. So it makes a kind of editorial sense to put those in a volume and say, the Canterbury Tales, a selection. That makes a kind of sense. And I have loved volumes like that. Same thing with the book we're dealing with today. It's Boccaccio's Decameron, which in its original is an enormous work of stories. A group of noble people escaping a plague retreat up into the hills and decide they will pass the time by telling stories. And the stories are often licentious and almost always entertaining. And when you read the unabridged Decameron, even if you're a fan of it, as I am, a huge fan of it, you will invariably notice that some of the stories are more effective than others. that is just, there's no argument there. That's not a controversial case. Some of the stories are more effective than others, more memorable, funnier, more picturesque. Some of them are a slog. So it's a natural thing for an editor to look at that massive work and think, well, for the high schools, for the freshman college courses, a selected Decameron might be a good idea. And that's what we have here. We have a Penguin Classic of tales from the Decameron, with a great choice of a scandalous Rockwell Kent. Rockwell Kent illustrated the whole of the Decameron almost a century ago. It makes me a little wistful because the Rockwell Kent complete illustrated Decameron was a staple of the kind of thing you could find at the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston. May it open again someday. But the editor decided here to put one of the more scandalous etchings on the cover here. But this is translated by Peter Hainsworth, and it's an example of what I'm talking about. It's not the whole of the Decameron. Instead, it's just tales. It's just selections from the Decameron, the highlights, what most people over the course of 400 years have said are their favorite Decameron stories are in here. Not all of them. So you get a very good introduction, a la Penguin Classics. You get very good notes, and then you get a careful selection of tales from the Decameron. I think that's interesting. I understand why these kinds of volumes exist. I don't ever go to them myself. Just in my personal Penguin library, I don't ever go to them myself. And this is a perfect example of why I don't know why I have this. I got it on this channel. I hauled it on this channel, but I don't know why I kept it. Hainsworth's introduction is good, but it's not that good. And I myself, I understand why this might be useful to schools, but I don't need an abridged classic. I don't want an abridged classic at all. And in this case, okay, you might be saying, all right, if that's true, then what you need is the complete Penguin Classic Decameron. But no, no. In this particular case, I am not. In this particular case, I'm going to go elsewhere. I'm going to go to W.W. Norton for an unabridged Decameron. The Wayne Rebhorn translation of the Decameron. And the reason I'm going to do that is not only because I genuinely like this translation better than the unabridged Penguin that I have had many times, but also because I'm blurbed. I'm blurbed in the paperback of this. And to be blurbed for the Decameron instead of for some make-weight new novel is an absolute thrill. It's just an absolute thrill. The absolute bookworm dream come true to be blurbed on a classic. The one step further than this has not happened yet, which is for me to be blurbed on a Penguin classic. That, as far as I know, has never happened. But this is awful close, and this is a translation that I really like. So so I kept this. I can't keep it with my Penguins, but this is the complete Decameron that I go to when I'm in need of such a thing. I didn't keep the hardcover because I'm on the paperback, and that's, I know, very silly, but nevertheless, it's a thrill. To have your name printed on a book you have read a million times is a thrill. So this is the one. The Rebhorn is the one that I keep for the unabridged, and for some reason I have still held on to the selected volume for Penguin. Maybe because the idea of having no Penguin Classic Boccaccio seems a little odd to me. Maybe that's the reason why I held on to it. That's not a very good reason. But anyway, that's your Penguin Classic for today, plus a Penguin adjacent recommendation. The Rebhorn in paperback will give you an excellent blurb. And it's the blurb, unfortunately, is the only part of this review that you're going to get, because it's from the Quarterly Conversation, which, as far as I know, doesn't exist anymore. It was a literary journal, an online literary journal, really good, top-notch stuff. Mostly reviews of stuff that I don't like, mostly venerating types of modern literature that I hold in contempt. But I really liked the editor, Scott Esposito, who wrote a couple of great pieces for Open Letters Monthly in our early issues. And I happily wrote many long, ruminative pieces for Scott for the Quarterly Conversation. But I don't know how to use the Wayback Machine or Internet Archives of that kind, so I have not done an exhaustive search for my full review of this translation of the Decameron. So for me, the only I don't have it, and I know that I don't have an easy link to it. So for me, the only echo of it is in that blurb, and it seems to be well and truly gone, because the Quarterly Conversation doesn't exist anymore, and also Scott Esposito doesn't exist anymore. He changed his gender. So that's, I think the whole thing is just well and truly disappeared into the past. I'll have to check and see if there's an archive somewhere that might have that whole piece and all the other pieces I did for the Quarterly Conversation. I wrote a lot for the Quarterly Conversation about contemporary Italian poetry that I really enjoyed doing, and also the Zibaldoni, the contemporary Italian, relatively contemporary Italian prose that, boy, oh boy, it was not an enjoyable thing. It was a very long book. But I had a great time writing that review. I'll have to see if those things are recoverable, if the Quarterly Conversation pieces are recoverable. But anyway, that is your Penguin Classic for today. Still in the height of the Renaissance. We'll see what tomorrow brings. We'll see where we are tomorrow. We still have quite a few of this first bookcase to go, but it won't last out the week. And then we'll be in the wild. Who knows what will follow after that? We'll find out together. Thank you, BookTube.